It's a real pleasure to introduce local global author and business journalist Ruchika Tulshyan to talk about her recent and timely book, The Diversity Advantage: Fixing Gender Inequality in the Workplace. Ruchika has lived and reported from all over the world: Singapore, Delhi, Atlanta, London, Seattle. She graduated from the London School of Economics and got a master's degree in journalism from Columbia University. She currently writes regularly for Forbes and locally for Crosscut, and has published with CNN Leading Women, Huffington Post, Vogue, Global Post, among others. Her international experience has given her broad perspective. And while gender equity may seem to be a topic that is much in the news currently, there are many of us here who remember when it wasn't. And I was reminded when speaking of Ruchika that only 5 years ago, when she first started covering topics on gender and equity and diversity, it was really still quite unusual. In fact, it was also difficult to get traction. It was much easier for her to publish stories on emerging tech businesses. And in addition, the print and media world, as we all know, was undergoing a radical transformation. So in fact, the vehicle that turned her away from pursuing a career as a human rights lawyer and got her hooked on journalism, an internship at Forbes Women, that no longer exists. But, on the other hand, she pointed out that now the New York Times, Fortune, the Huffington Post all have verticals on gender and equity issues. So really, in just a very short period of time, these issues have come to the forefront. She's been covering them. She's been talking about them. Seattle likes to think of itself as a liberal bastion, and there are people here who are doing really good work on this front. But we can also learn from Ruchika and from her book about how much more progressive our policies could be to match those in India, for example, where 3 months of paid family leave is the norm and the law. The United States and Lesotho, while they do provide mandated unpaid leave, are the only countries that do not require employers to provide paid time off for new parents. And since we're a library and particularly focused on books and writing, I hope Ruchika will also talk a bit about her experience in publishing this book. She said the library was one of her favorite places growing up in Singapore, and she would have loved to have written her book here in folio, as we would have loved for her to have written it here.
So I wanted to start the evening by talking about another book, one that I would say inspired the diversity advantage. Back in 2012, Sheryl Sandberg, the chief operating officer of Facebook, wrote a landmark book in feminism and certainly corporate feminism called Lean In. In it, Ms. Sandberg wrote that women end up doing a number of things that act as barriers in their advancement opportunities at work. In fact, she's quoted as saying that most of the time, or rather a lot of the times, women actually end up being the biggest stumbling block to their career advancement. Most significantly, they choose to step back when they become mothers or not even try for a great advancement opportunity. And her answer and solution was to lean in. Back then, as a fairly new reporter, certainly for Forbes Woman magazine, which, as Margaret said, no longer exists, although ForbesWoman.com is still alive, I was writing about gender at work and lapped up everything the book advocated for. Indeed, studies have shown that men apply for jobs when they only have 60% of all the qualifications listed, whereas women wait until they have 100% of listed qualifications. So indeed, there are inherent differences between the sexes. And yet, as I put the advice of lean in into practice in my own career, I decided to lean in, I dared, I negotiated my salary, I tried to exude confidence, and specifically as a woman in tech, I saw that leaning in wasn't a solution for most women. Many are considered unlikable, even untrustworthy when they do lean in. Troubled by a growing narrative in what I call the fix women camp, coupled with statistics like 43% of working moms leave corporate America, I was convinced that while there was a place for lean in, the equation was incomplete. As I decided to research and start interviewing for my book, what I found is that there are systemic barriers to women being recruited to, retained within, and especially advanced through organizations in every industry and in every country in the world. What became even more stark and compelling, though, as I started doing that research, is how much global economies benefit from fully leveraging female talent in the workplace, as well as global companies. The United States, for example, would add close to 5% to its GDP if they fully harness the power of women in the workplace. Global companies could actually end up saving $19 billion annually if they mandated 16 weeks of fully paid maternity leave. Most importantly, diverse teams make better decisions and are more innovative than homogeneous teams. What I had set out to write as a sort of, here's the problem we need to fix, quickly became, here are the barriers, but here are the solutions that are possible to implement. And oh, by the way, our economy, the society, and yes, your business stands to gain from this. I was lucky to find willing leaders from companies in India, Germany, Switzerland, Singapore, and more to talk to me. I learned how Deloitte's Women's Network, which was mandated by the CEO, became a powerful resource on understanding how women executives make buying decisions. The initiative actually generated $750 million in revenue for the company over 3 years. So clearly, there's a very strong business case for it. The reality is that there still is no country in the world where we are at complete parity with white men in the workforce. That's alarming when you think that women are graduating college at a higher rate than men in the United States. I'm convinced that we are now at an inflection point right in the world as we contend with more transparency enabled by technology, but yet greater geopolitical risks spurred by living in an interconnected world. And from rising powers in the East, it is becoming imperative to harness our full workforce and the diversity that we have in our own backyards. Thank you.
It's fun to hear how much research you've done internationally on this. I think locally we read a lot here, what's going on in each state or each region, and what's going on nationally. I know in particular the Chamber is really focused on this with our initiative called 100% Talent, which I know are well aware of. So I'd be curious to know a little bit more about what are the connections you saw in your research internationally and what's going on here in Seattle?
Yeah, this is really interesting. So actually what I found when I looked internationally is that there certainly are barriers that are very country and region specific. So for example, I looked at India and I spoke to executives in India and people who manage hiring decisions and recruiting and advancing women in organizations like Citibank South Asia, which is actually quite a large business for Citibank worldwide. And what they found is, issues like safety and societal issues and societal pressures for women to opt out of the workplace when they become mothers was a really huge issue that they had to contend with. And they talked about the initiatives they had started to ensure that they were able to, keep women throughout that time. And then when you look at the United States, but then as Margaret mentioned, India just by legally has a very strong mandate for the amount of paid maternity leave you get. So it's 6 months actually, and that's pretty robust if you think about it. And the United States, for example, has no maternity leave, no paid maternity leave, and it's very much up to the individual. And we're starting to see inequities based on where for example, high tech or very highly skilled workers, companies are starting to offer paid parental leave for them. And for lower skilled workers, for workers who hold hourly wage jobs, that's not even a possibility. So we're actually already starting to see inequities that are growing within women in different industries. So to kind of round back to your question, there are certainly regional and country differences. When it comes to Seattle, what's really cool and why I love this place is because there's so many growing industries. We're the leader in so many, certainly in technology, when we think about things like cloud computing, when we think about artificial intelligence. So in a lot of industries, we are leaders. But what we're starting to find is women are actually being left out of these industries. They're either not being recruited, and there is a pipeline problem, and I'm sure we'll talk about the pipeline issues in STEM, but something like 52% of women who actually end up joining STEM careers or STEM organizations also end up leaving them. And so we are talking about this huge issue, and I think Seattle really has an opportunity to change it, where there are opportunities to recruit women and advance them through that are very unique to this region, that would be different from some of the things that we see in other parts of the world.
Thank you. So I have a quick question as somebody who has spent 6 months traveling around India. I am shocked to hear that they require 6 months of paid family leave. And what do you know much about maternity leave? What does that policy look like? Does that apply to all employers? Is that, I've spent a lot of time walking around India, and there's some significant challenges.
Yes, certainly white collar workers are required to are eligible for 6 months paid maternity leave. The issue that starts to happen is a lot of women start to get off track at that time, or many of them take maternity leave and then they don't come back. And part of that actually ends up being societal pressures, as I mentioned. And, there's this deep-seated, and my parents are from India, and there's a deep-seated sort of bias that once a woman gets married, like that should be her career and that should be her whole job. And actually what ends up being really interesting is when I looked at the United States, supposedly we're very progressive here, we're very forward-thinking, et cetera. Still 43% of women with children leave. So there are these societal barriers that we need to talk about, and a big part of resolving that will actually come from offering paid parental leave. So paid maternity leave is part of it, but paid parental leave is really going to be where we move the needle towards getting more equity in the workplace.
That's great. So you talked a little bit about this, about women who leave the workforce, and a lot of folks say that's their choice. So how do you respond to people who say, well, women may make less and there may be this gender pay gap, but it's based on the decisions that women make of their own free will?
Yeah, I think I always laugh when people say that, because the reality is, and if we look around us, Seattle is a great landscape for this, it's actually become almost impossible for families to be just single income. It's just become so difficult to operate in the environment that we live in right now in the economy. We look at house prices, certainly, right outside in our great city, and it's actually become impossible to be part of a relationship where you only have one person working. Coupled with, Seattle actually has one of the highest rates of single working mothers who are the primary breadwinners. So when people say things like that, I think it sounds good in theory, and we're talking about, we think that it's a very meritocratic society, but the reality is most women don't actually get to make that choice. And a lot of women continue to be in the workplace. They continue to be kind of channeled and funneled into these jobs that do not lead to advancement opportunities. And we see this at every level. In fact, what was really, really surprising was the Wall Street Journal recently published some great data on the fact that actually women who are the most highly qualified, women in fields like medicine and who are financial advisors, actually experience some of the biggest wage gaps. And this is for literally doing the same job and working the same amount of hours. So we haven't reached a stage where we can say that a lot of it is based on women's choice. It's not. There are other systemic barriers that are holding women back.
It's super interesting. And as we talk about a lot of these different systemic and dynamic reasons as to why there is this gender wage gap, we know that it exists to a greater degree for women of color. Why do you think that is?
So there is research that shows that we're all a little bit sexist and we are all a little bit racist, and some of us more than others. But the reality is a big amount of it comes down to implicit biases that we all hold. And there are inherent barriers and inherent ideas that we have towards how competent someone will be based on their race. So women of color and Latina women, when it comes to the wage gap, it's so severe. We're talking in some industries, Latina women make 54 cents to a white man's dollar, which is really significant. So women of color face systemic barriers for a variety of reasons. There's implicit biases. There certainly are barriers to actually getting into certain industries. So I once interviewed a Latina. She was a scientist, and she said years of being part of an industry where she was constantly mistaken for the janitor, constantly mistaken for the coat check girl, constantly sort of dealt with a lot of passive-aggressive behavior, made her want to opt out of the industry altogether. So there are opportunity gaps, certainly when it comes to education, when it comes to being able to actually get into those prime jobs. But even when you get there, you face these barriers, which, women have to make those decisions. Do I want to put up with this on a daily basis, or is it time for me to opt out?
I think we all have stories where we can relate to that. As a white woman, people see that I'm a woman, but I get the benefit of being white. But I remember when I was working as a district director, and this woman came up to me and she said, "Oh, is that the new phrase that we're using for secretary?"
Really terrible. I'm hoping, actually, MEADOW, that people within the audience will share some of the experiences they've had as well when we get to Q&A, because I learn so much when people tell me literally what they have been through or shared, various experiences that they've been through. And discrimination doesn't only come in the form of gender or race. There's a lot of class-based discrimination. I was really pleased to learn that Accenture, I think it was last year, announced that they're going to actually do away with requiring people to only apply with bachelor's degrees, and kind of, not even ask the question, do you have a bachelor's or undergrad degree at all? Because that is a barrier, and there are people, for very many reasons, have been compelled to forego education. Let's not even talk about student loans, but forego graduate or undergraduate education, but are very well qualified to work in a certain industry. So, yeah.
I know you focus a lot on the personal stories that people have experienced. What do you think the power is kind of behind those stories and sharing, whether it's the example that you just shared or the example that I just shared, or many other anecdotes that we could come up?
Actually, I think what we started to see is that the more we started talking about these sort of oppressive, a little bit of the oppression that, again, women but different people face in the workplace, we started forming some sort of a community. And I saw this a lot with the work I started doing initially with Forbes, and then continued in the various different places that I wrote for. And I was really inspired to hear from a lot of women who came forward and told me stories about sexism they experienced in technology. I was also really inspired to hear from various people who ended up reading my book when it came out in the ebook version, and sort of started rethinking things like their hiring practices. Especially ensuring things, something as small as, I found in my research that having one woman in your interview process makes such a huge difference, in the number of women who get hired in your company, because it's a two-way process, and as you go up, as you start interviewing and as you start recruiting for very high-level positions, it's kind of like a date. It really matters what the other person thinks as well. And I actually had this incident where I was working in technology, and I had an all-male, 5-hour-long, like kind of a pressure test loop. And at the end of it, my instincts told me, I'm not going to fit in here. This isn't going to be the right environment for me. And by the time I left, I was right. It wasn't the right environment. And that first interaction should have tipped me off. And it does tip off a lot of people as they begin their careers. So I think there's a lot to do, there's a lot of little practical, actionable steps we can take. And the only way employers are going to start listening and thinking about it as if they actually hear about it. So there are some great resources out there. There's a website I love called fairygodboss.com. And what it does is it actually allows women to anonymously submit reviews on what it's like to be a working woman in that company. So Amazon's featured, Microsoft's featured, there are a lot of other companies, large and small, but it really gives you, it's kind of like a salary.com or Glassdoor, but what it's like to be a woman working in that company.
There's a few others I recently ran across, and I'm drawing a blank as to what it was, but they go through and they also ask folks, what are the things that you look for that appeal to you? Like, what would attract you to a business? And it was interesting. A lot of folks think the thing that surprised me the most, I think they have like 20 different options, and paid family leave or paid maternity leave was like number 12. But things like, competitive salary, generous leave, all these other things like a flexible workforce were, some of these things that we also underestimate, like, oh, well, we'll just throw some paid family leave in there and we'll be golden. We've checked that box.
Actually, and the other thing I found while writing this book is millennials actually really, really look for, and millennials are going to be the largest demographic in our workforce probably in under 10 years. And what we found is actually there are a lot of similarities and overlaps in what would keep women in the workforce and advance women in the workforce, and what would actually attract and retain millennials in the workforce. So paid family leave is there for both genders, actually, not just women. A flexible work environment, working in an environment that really looks for values and family values and cultural values and instills those within the company are very important in a way that other generations didn't look for it in the same way. So it would really be smart for employers to start looking at it now, whether you're a one-person company and thinking of hiring your first employee, or you're a 100,000 or 500,000 person global organization.
That's great. So when you've looked at these, we talked a little bit about the policies in India, and we've talked about kind of what different regions or nations have done differently or done well, or what they've legislated. Where have you found, what regions have you found to be the most effective in tackling the gender wage gap?
Yeah, we hear a lot about it, and certainly in this election season, but Western Europe has certainly led the way, and a lot of the Nordic countries have definitely found they've made a lot of progress. As I said in my remarks, not one country has reached a stage where men and women are exactly the same, where they're paid the same, where they have the same advancement opportunities, where there's equal representation within corporate, certainly in corporate companies. But what's really interesting is actually there is an overlap between political representation and how companies kind of foster workplaces. So in countries, again, the Nordic countries come to mind, where we see women have a lot of representation in political office. We also see a lot of women having representation, whether it's at company leadership levels, or it's certainly whether it comes to things like paid family leave being available. Whereas in countries like the United States, where we really have abysmal numbers of women in political representation, and I'd love to hear you tell us a little bit more about this, but where we see a real mismatch in what our country's demographics look like and actually who's making decisions, we see a lot of gender inequities persist, and certainly paid family leave is right at the top of that.
That's great. So your book focuses a lot on recruiting, retaining, and promoting, and you spent a lot of time kind of on that promoting women in the executive kind of arena. Why do you focus on that? Why do you think that's important?
Well, actually, bringing it down to Seattle, we, in our region, in our progressive liberal region, only 16.5% of corporate board positions are actually held by women. So we're actually, we lag the national numbers, and that's really sad because we have some great companies here, certainly companies that are changing the world in different ways. So I think when it comes to things like corporate board representation, I really believe in having more women for many, many reasons. One is decision making and cultural factors. So I spoke with a woman in India where recently they had a government mandate that at least 10% of women on boards had, of 10% of the boards had to be made up of women of corporate publicly listed companies. And even though there were incidents of where someone's mother or someone's wife or someone's sister would be quickly recruited to the board, there were instances of cultural change being made. Because we're talking about the leaders of a company, and most of the time when I speak, I get asked, is this a bottom-up movement or is this a top-down movement? And the sad reality is it is a top-down movement. My book reinforced this again and again and again and again. I would talk to leaders on how to recruit more women, and I would talk to leaders about how to get more women on corporate boards. And at every level, you need senior leadership buy-in. So if you don't have representation there, who's going to pick this up as a cause, right?
I think that's absolutely fascinating, and stunned to hear that it's 16.5% represent on corporate boards. And then my instant thought is, oh my gosh, how do we change that? Is there where do you sign up for boot camp to learn how to be on a corporate board, or, how do we break that? And I think that's a really, really big challenge. And I think that's one of the issues that we're constantly looking at. You talked a little bit about how, and this was an astonishing number to me the first time I'd heard it, how I think it was 42% of women who go into STEM end up leaving. Yeah. So, 52. Or 52%. So it's not even just the pipeline of training people and getting the degrees, which we often hear about. We need to produce more degrees. We need more girls interested in STEM. And you're seeing a lot of initiatives, whether it was, I think Google just did their little emoji initiative where they had scientist women, and you're seeing a lot of focus on whether it's Legos or Barbies or whatnot that girls and women have exposure to, are showing a lot more of that exposure into STEM fields. But if they're not even staying in STEM fields, it seems like we've got a really big challenge there. Did you dig into sort of what the reasons were that people aren't staying in STEM?
So my book wasn't industry specific, but a lot of the writing I started doing afterwards, and certainly when I started covering it regionally for Crosscut being, I looked a lot at women in technology, and there were some really, really systemic barriers, whether it's culturally, and again, I worked in tech, so I saw some of this, and whether it's you walk into a meeting and it's all male, or nobody looks like you, and you feel a little, you feel quite out of place, and that actually builds up over time. You're at an organization for a few years and still nobody looks like you, and you're the only one, and there's this issue of tokenism. It also really shows up in advancement opportunities. So we had some large companies here in our region announce, hey, guess what, we don't have gender pay gap, where men and women are paid absolutely equally at our companies. And I was thinking, well, that's great, but how many women are actually in leadership positions at your company, right? Is the question, are men and women getting paid equally? Well, that's also a big issue in a lot of industries. It's not really in tech. Tech actually has negligible difference when it comes to paying men and women equally generally. A lot of tech companies has this. But what about leadership positions? And those advancement opportunities just don't become available. So I can imagine why so many women over the years decide to leave tech, even if that ends up being something they love.
So as you've talked to and interviewed people, what are the most common things that women experience kind of in the workforce? And you talked about after you read Lean In, you sit at the table, ask for that raise or, assert yourself more often. And I admit I did the same thing. And I made my husband read Lean In. It got to the point where I was reading, oh, you got to hear this. And he goes, okay, I'll just read the book. But it's true when you do these things, women are told, oh, you're speaking up too much, or you're being too bossy or too firm, or you get all of these different critiques. What's the most common feedback you've heard, or the stories you've heard?
Yeah, definitely. Women say that they're not considered team players, that they're actually definitely considered less likable. There are studies done on what happened what happens when women CEOs speak up at the same frequency as male CEOs, and at almost at every point, men and women actually judge women more harshly for speaking up. So we are talking about very deep-rooted implicit biases where we believe women should show up in a certain way. They should always be likable. I'm actually working on a story for Forbes about how women end up doing more favors, office favors, and things like, oh, okay, well, you need this paper looked at, I'll look at it. You need this committee and certainly in academia, you need me to sit on these committees which wouldn't affect my career or promotion or advancement opportunities. I'll do it, or women are expected to do these things. And it actually ends up impacting their careers, right? Because we only have a finite amount of time in our day. So if men are able to say no or expected not to volunteer for these opportunities that actually don't lead to their advancement, but women are by default expected to, or considered less likable if they actually say no thanks, this isn't going to help me advance in my career, so I'm going to say no, they're considered less likable. So we're kind of facing a double bind all the time. Yeah.
So I want to open this up in just a second, but I've got one more question, because you've talked a bit about implicit bias, and I know we talked about this earlier. I think it's super powerful to talk about it and to have folks share their experiences so we can be more aware of how these sorts of things play out. But how do you learn what your implicit biases are, and how do you challenge those things? How do I grow as a person?
Yeah. There is a lot of work being done around implicit biases in large companies, for example, like Google. There are online tests that you can do, and I know we talked about this earlier, but the Harvard there's an implicit bias test online called the Harvard Implicit Bias Test, right? And you go online and you match up words with pictures, and you find out, what's your rate of being racist, what's your rate of being feminist, and these sorts of things. Knowing and making yourself aware of these things is part of the equation. And for example, at Google, when managers went through implicit biases tests and then training and then had to make promotion decisions, they told the New York Times that actually it made them stop and think, like, hey, am I promoting this female engineer correctly? Am I even considering her in the running? Or should I, what are the things I need to consider when making these promotion decisions? So still a lot of the advancement decisions, a lot of the decisions on who to hire are being made by all men. And it's important to be able to look at your biases and check them. The research around this is still very new, I will admit. So I would love to say that there's a magic bullet, you find out you're sexist, and then you take this bullet or this pill and you're magically cured of it. It's obviously not that way. The research around it is still very, very new, but making yourself aware is so important. So the Harvard Implicit Bias Test is really one of the beginnings, but it's by no means comprehensive in every single way, nor is it foolproof.
That's great. So I think I've asked quite a few questions, and I'd love to hear questions from other folks. And I know you were talking about wanting to hear kind of more about personal experiences.
Since we are such an intimate group, I think it's a great opportunity to hear.
So I'll hand this over to David, and he'll.
So I want you to speak into this microphone so that it's recorded by Seattle Channel, and speak up because we don't have speakers here. So, do I have a question? There, go right ahead.
So you mentioned that one of the problems with using Lean In as a solution is that women then are considered less likable when they actually do it. How much does that likability factor start to factor into other things? I mean, how much does it really matter whether or not you're liked?
It matters in the workplace. It matters when it comes to whether you're being considered for advancement opportunities. In a social setting, it's really up to the individual, and I truly, truly believe that. But when it comes to the fact that when you behave the same way that a man does, you have the exact same qualifications, everything else is equal. You actually behaved in the same way as this man. You advocated for yourself, you negotiated, but you're considered less likable and therefore less promotable, less of a team player, less of a leader. I have a problem with that. So when it comes to likability, again, in a social setting, it's up to the individual how they want to show up, and I totally believe in that. But if it means that you're qualified, you're considered less qualified just because you've advocated for yourself, I think we need to rethink that.
Where there was an analysis done of performance evaluations, and where they go through the different words to describe men and women. And if you will find words that maybe 5% of the time that they are used to describe men, but 75% of the time they are used to describe women. And a lot of that can come back to that likability and how that's characterized. It's pretty fascinating to see.
I'll go again. So following on to that, I've, of course, had a number of those words show up in my performance reviews. But the story I want to share is that until, I think, 3 years ago, when we had a women's conference at work that I attended, which freaked me out on many levels, it had never occurred to me in my entire career, in my entire life, in fact, to ever even consider that my gender could have anything to do with anything that happened to me. I knew that sexism was a huge problem. I'd watched my mom have a lot of problems with it. She was an outspoken, brilliant college professor, and she taught, when I was a young child, she taught in an engineering school, and I watched her move halfway across the country to get out of that job because of the sexism she was experiencing. So I knew that it happened, but it had never occurred to me to think of it. And then I went to this conference, and one of the topics of conversation was the myth of the aggressive woman. And I had, less than a month earlier, had gotten a performance review where I was referred to in writing in my performance review as aggressive. And it kind of hit me as a bombshell at the end of that talk that, for the first time in my life, I'm wondering if maybe that got written down for me when I talked to my coworkers, a couple of the men who are at least as aggressive as I am, and I said, have you ever been called aggressive? And he said, well, yeah, people have commented occasionally that I need to back off a little bit. I said, no, I mean in your reviews. He said, what, like written down in my review? No, of course not. And it had never occurred to me before. So it was a bit of a disconcerting bombshell for me to start. And now, of course, my most recent one said that I am brash and occasionally disruptive, and I'm kind of thinking, well, I wonder if you'd consider me quite as brash and disruptive if I was a little bit of a man. And it's changed my life to start actually thinking about whether or not my gender has anything to do with the way that I'm perceived at work. It's very irritating.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. And you're so right. The same, even if men and women, firstly, it's rare that men and women will be described the same way in performance reviews. And even when they are, a man being called aggressive is actually a positive thing. And a woman being called aggressive ends up being negative, And again, those same ideas of likability. Is she a team player? Does she have leadership? Consensus building, all of those things start coming to the fore. So I know, MEADOW, would you like to talk about that? I know we talked about it earlier with your experiences or something you've observed when it comes to words that come up in performance reviews or the way people are.
I mean, I have I'm pretty well known, I think, in my professional world as somebody who is assertive and can sometimes be brash and these things that I never, I focus on getting my work done. I'm not personally condescending to people. And so it was really surprising to me. I've had a few different jobs where I work next to men who, there can be a lot of egos in politics with really sharp elbows, and somehow certain behavior like that was okay and looked upon as like somebody who's really confident and has their stuff together, but then this oh, how do people perceive you, MEADOW, in this environment? So it was blatantly, brought up to me, and I've had a couple of different. Ruchika and I were having some conversations this morning around not just sort of your behavior, but there was also I sat in a bunch of meetings, and there were several times where I would be interrupted by this particular gentleman. And on several occasions when I would say, wait a second, I wasn't done talking, even women in the group would say, oh, don't interrupt. He's not done with his thought. And so I was just like, but I just got interrupted. And so I think, there's so many different ways in which we are perceived and we're experienced. And like you, I first started my career working in real estate, and I was like, oh yeah, sexism exists. Things like, I know these things happen and go on. And the more that I've learned about it, and then the more that I've grown professionally in my career, the more I'm just like jaw on the ground, like, did that just happen? I mean, I have had people that I work with tell me about when I should or shouldn't be planning to have children. Never mind the fact that I haven't even decided whether or not I want to have children. And it's pretty astonishing what people are willing to say to women.
I was wondering if you feel that there are different tactics that should be used during salary negotiation from men versus women, and I'll say it in the context of supporting several coworkers. They're going forward. I know they're close to being promoted. Once the business decides on a person, it seems to me that's your opportunity. They don't want to go through the hiring process either, so you have this opportunity. Should they use different tactics, or have you felt like different tactics work for women better than men when it comes to that moment?
Yeah, so this is this is a little tricky for me to answer, because so much of my book is based on this idea that we need to change the organizations, and we really need to train managers when they make these pay and promotion decisions. But at the same time, I really strongly believe in data. And, I think whether you're a man or a woman, and this is, again, where men get away a lot more than women do, but make a very strong case using data. And that way you've removed the emotion from, the conversation. You've removed the discussion, which could be about likability or those sorts of things, and it very much about the fact that this is what the industry is demanding. This is how much work I've done. This is what this is what I should be getting, and make it very sort of data and analytics based. So that's definitely something that I talk about, and that's something that I believe in. I have also seen, I have interviewed someone off the record and written about someone's experience actually locally, where she went and she tried to negotiate for herself, and she was a star person at this company, and she was totally dismissed. And she had the data and she had the analytics. And then she had been, because she worked in high tech, she had been aggressively recruited, and she loved her job, but she had, she got calls from recruiters every week. And when after being dismissed this way, she actually then decided, okay, well, maybe it's time for me to, look around. And she looked around, and she got a much higher offer than even what she was asking for, what she was negotiating for. And she was actually able to then bring that number back to the table. But by that time, so much trust had been lost in the process. You know what I mean? So I think it's really up to companies to start looking at these sorts of incidences and think about it much more. I do believe women should negotiate in the same way I think men should negotiate, but we do have to realize that the outcomes are almost always different. Yeah.
How does an organization that doesn't have buy-in at the senior leadership level begin working on this? So at what level can people start making a change, and what would that look like? What's step one?
There's always hope, I believe. I truly believe that. Coca-Cola came out of the largest class action lawsuit in history for racial discrimination. And that kicked off, I would say, one of the most robust women's networks, global women's networks I have ever seen. So there are things that happen as a result of this, but yes, we're talking about a multi-million-dollar lawsuit, which involved getting legislators involved and that sort of thing. So we're talking about something really, really large. I think the number one thing is, the reality is that there's a huge business case here. And if we're able to show senior leadership, look at the number of people who leave. Look at the fact that we're not being able to recruit, diversity. There's a lot of research that actually shows that, diverse teams really outperform homogenous ones. I think it's about making senior leadership aware of the opportunity cost. At the end of the day, if you're at a very senior position at a company and you don't believe in gender equity, then a big part of it, I would believe, is that you do believe in the bottom line, right? You do believe in the profit motive. And there's a huge amount of profitability to be realized when you actually harness the talent around women. So I think to really make it pervasive throughout the organization, it has to come from senior leadership, or maybe a level down, or there are ways to do it. But again and again, when I was talking to people within my book, they talked about how they did start initiatives. They may have started the first women's network at the company, and then it just turned into this socializing happy hour sort of thing where there was no way to actually move forward with it. Where there have been changes is where a group of women have gotten together at various companies, and there is one at the local level as well. I'll see if I'm able to write about it maybe for Crosscut, where a group of women came together and went to their senior leadership and said, we know there's a gender pay gap. We know here's the data to show that, you know, Tom in doing the same role as me is making more money than I am. And we want to go public with this, or please do something about it. And the company did something about it. And last week, the House of Cards star celebrity Robin Wright said the same thing. You know, she said, I'm doing just as good a job as Kevin Spacey. I'm in every episode. I've directed many. I should be making the same amount of money. Do it or I'll go public. So there is this level of sort of a little more, you know, in a digital world, there's an opportunity to make a case for it. There's an opportunity to bring all this information to light. But it really has to be top down. I cannot emphasize that enough, unfortunately. But I think more leaders are starting to realize this.
Can I follow on to that? Yeah. The second question would be, so let's say you get buy-in from senior leadership. How do you begin the process of diversifying, or both in gender or in cultural diversity, without tokenizing anyone? So what's the first wave of that look like before you've actually reached that level of diversity?
So I'll be quick, and then I would love MEADOW to go. But what I talk about in the book is really about identifying where some of your biggest blind spots are. So it's actually not going out and quickly doing a quick initiative, let's hire more women, let's do this, let's do that. It's actually stepping back, and it's having a good, hard look at where you are right now. You know, do you have trouble retaining women? Do you have trouble attracting women? Do you have trouble advancing women? Is there a salary wage gap thing going on there? Where should you start? Because it's different for every company based on the industry, based on the company culture, based on which region in the world you're in. So my number one advice is first to step back and see where you're at, and then start making decisions based on that. Another thing that works really well is anonymous company surveys. So I would absolutely encourage leaders to start, sending those out and trying to get valuable feedback that can really be used to guide a lot of the initiatives. So you're not tokenizing, you're not just suddenly going out into the world and saying, we're hiring more women, but you're actually thinking about how to enforce a very strong and robust culture that would keep women even if they get hired into the company.
So I want to say, I don't think all hope is lost when there's no female leadership up at in senior representation. So part of our gender equity initiative at the Seattle Chamber, 100% talent. There's a motorcycle rally going on outside. We sit down. We have a goal to have. In the first 5 years of this initiative, we want to have 500 businesses signed up and over half of the employees represented. And what this does is it changes the conversation. So we have sat down with a number of folks, and it's a long process to get a company to sign on because, one, these issues and the reason that these pay gaps exist are systemic, they're institutional, and a lot of these things are based on subjective information. And so you're like, well, I'm sure there's a rationale for this, right? And so you've kind of got to unearth that and learn about those implicit biases. But when just by having the conversation, just by us going and sitting down and saying, we have this initiative, it's, we're from the business community, we think this is an important issue, there is a business case to be made for this. Here are 31 best practices that you can look at. And people have, just this morning, it was yesterday morning, we sat down with a pretty large company who said, I haven't even really thought about this issue. And we're really excited to figure out how they learn more and wanted some more resources. And so I think even when there isn't representation in the business, I think in civic circles, we have to elevate this conversation, and whether it's books like The Diversity Advantage or It's articles that we're seeing and we're sharing. It's about elevating that conversation and that narrative so people become more accustomed to it.
I want to ask a political question, and I'm puzzled at the failure of Hillary to appeal to younger women, at least the polling showing that. We'll see how it ends up there. And in that context, I'm reminded of Obama's famous remark to her that you're likable enough, Hillary, and what that might indicate about, you know, how she positions herself in a lot of these issues.
Wow. I'm going to let Meadow take this, but I will say when it comes to likability for any underrepresented population, it seems to be a huge challenge and a huge focus area. So when I think of Barack Obama as well, I think likability was very, very much a strong suit that he had. He had this natural charisma. And I think it's something that's demanded of people from underrepresented populations in every, whether you're female, whether you're of color, of any other underrepresentation population, which is not demanded of, for example, someone like Donald Trump. So I'm gonna kick it off that way.
So in full disclosure, in 2008, I caucused for Hillary Clinton, and I did again this year. And I think she's a tremendously inspiring person who has been battered by every sort of, I mean, her stamina to be able to be painted as, oh, she's a woman, so she's too emotional, she can't do this, or she's too mean, or she's too this, or she's too that. The way she dresses, her hair scrunchies, like, you know, she's too abrasive. It's astonishing to me, and it's one of the reasons why I admire her so much, is her ability to try to find her way when no way of her being is okay with a significant amount of people, and her willingness to be able to sort of change her mind and grow as her role has grown and as our community has changed and our society has changed. So without, you know, with my whole gush fest about Hillary aside, I did go to my precinct caucuses this year, and I was really surprised to see one, there was more of a balance in my precinct or in my district in terms of people supporting Bernie Sanders and people supporting Hillary Clinton. But the thing that I saw was the people who were supporting Hillary were apologetic about it. And they were like, well, she's pragmatic, or she's, you know, I think she can win, or, well, she's got more experience. And the people who talked, and it was largely, I would say middle-aged people or older folks. There were a few young folks that were supportive of Hillary, but again, it was very apologetic. And the people who were supportive of Bernie, it reminded me of the things that people would say about Obama, and about he's not part of this status quo. He's willing to say things that are different, and he's got a vision. And he doesn't have that same. He's been in office for a long time, but he doesn't have that same scrutiny that Hillary has faced. And I think it was really telling when seeing folks that were not really willing to stand up and say that they were inspired. And I think it has a lot to do with our just the culture that we have and the environment we have, and whether it's women in the workforce, whether it's women in political office, it is. I mean, one need only look a couple of weeks ago on the city council where the women members of the council who voted against the arena, and the horrifying things, the absolute horrifying things. And I've worked in politics for almost a decade now, and I have read and seen and heard a lot of really horrifying things. I have never read or seen or heard the types of graphic things that people were saying about our female legislators on the city council. And so women, I think, are just under a different scrutiny, and I think that does transcend down, and I think that impacts younger generations, and it's hard to kind of move beyond.
A few years ago, I heard Condoleezza Rice speak, and the things she said to me, which stuck in my mind, and maybe at the back of my mind was the reason why I wrote this book, is she said, as a woman, and certainly as a woman of color, you have to work twice as hard to be considered half as good. And I think Hillary is definitely dealing with some of that. The other reality is I would never advocate for voting for anyone or being on anyone's team simply because of their gender. And that's something I talk about in my book as well. I'm not talking about this human rights feel-good thing. There has to be a very strong case, a business case in, when we talk about gender diversity in the workforce, but even in politics, you need to vote because you believe in someone, you believe in their policies, you believe in the action that they're going to take. Saying that, the amount of backlash that I have seen against Hillary is really very surprising, considering that one of the other political candidates has come out and said very, very nasty things and alienated entire populations, be it women, be it immigrants, be it people from different countries. So it's surprising, and I shudder to think what would happen if a woman said those things. Would she be able to get away with it? I don't think so.
I think just one other interesting thing to add on to that, the same barriers that we see in the business world for women to get move up in the world, you also see in the political world. So on average, I think it's a woman needs to be asked 7 or 8 times to run for office, and then they will want to go through and make sure that they're credentialed, that they really know their stuff. They're going to want to account more so for family impact or embarrassing their family. There's a lot more of the fear of shame or embarrassment that goes into it. And we, as a culture, we do no favors when we should be critical where criticism is deserved, but we should focus on the issues and the ways we treat female elected leaders, the ways we treat females in pop culture. Really, really make it hard for a lot of women to want to put their name out there.
Yeah. I see this as a journalist on the internet all the time, and it's ridiculous. It makes no sense whatsoever because most of the attacks are ad hominem. They're very rarely to do with the actual work being presented. It's usually to do with and again, not only me, but just speaking with other journalists, it's usually to do with the way you look or something else that's completely irrelevant to the case that you've presented. Yeah, and I've certainly faced enough of that too. So, yeah.
I also could just
This'll
talk
have
to you
to be
later.
your
But
last.
I promise this is my last question. I'll let other people ask. But on that topic, because you are primarily in the field of journalism, are there structures within the field of journalism that you think need to be broken down or archived that are primarily disadvantaging people of color or women, such as commenting, where when people comment on an article that's written by a man, it's primarily either just attacking like you are stupid or your head's up your ass or something, but something like that. Whereas when it's a female author, it tends to, be an attack on the fact that she's a woman, some kind sexual or violent accusations or wishes for those people. And so what within the field of journalism would you say needs to be sunsetted in order to pave the way for a more inclusive industry? And that's the last question, I promise.
I'm actually on the founding editorial team of a women's website called The Establishment, and we made a very strong and concerted decision not to have comments, and that even came at the risk of whether it would be page views or all those data and metrics that later on come very much in handy as you try and grow. But we believed that some of the topics we talked about would be sensitive, that our writers were discussing, and we wanted them to feel protected and part of an environment that really looked out for them. And so we made that decision not to have comments, and we've been told again and again and again by our writers, thank you so much for not having a comment section. So I think you kind of answered your own question. I think not having a comment section helps tremendously, but it's also about being called out about editors and people, again, in decision-making capabilities, calling out and reinforcing and having structures to moderate, comments that are completely, completely irrelevant, completely just obviously gender or racially motivated. So I think having those structures in place would help. It's still not a perfect system, you know. And again, when we look at commenting and we look at attacks that are made, you know, towards women in the public eye, the solutions still seem to be very women, fix the woman focus, you know. So I've been told, like, grow thicker skin. Oh, he's just silly. He didn't mean that. That's fine. Like, you don't need to worry about it. And of course, you know, it's very hurtful. It sometimes worries me, you know, do I still want to continue talking about issues like gender diversity or the pay gap or things like that if I'm going to be attacked on things that have nothing to do with some of the cases that I'm presenting? So there is a deeper societal issue, but I think doing away with comments was one way that we looked at it, and it's helped tremendously.
So you mentioned that a huge part of the solution that you see is advancing women in leadership positions. There is concurrently a phenomenon of how women judge women more harshly. Do you have recommendations to mitigate this phenomenon?
I wish I had an answer to that. Unfortunately, I don't have a solution for something like that. I will say that in environments where there is a very low level of women in leadership, for example, there was one study that found that in most S&P 1500 companies where there were indeed women on the board or in the executive team, there was room for only one woman. So there was this mentality that one and done, no more. You know, we've kind of checked our box, we filled our quota, we're done. And I think environments like that can end up being very very difficult as well for women. And there is that idea of competition is really strong. And I saw this as a woman in technology, where I saw that there was a very small amount of positions that were available for women, and I could see that those sharp elbows came out, and you know, they were very much prevalent in some of the teams that I saw. So part of it is definitely changing the culture to ensure that it is an environment where more women feel supported and are able to advance. The other side of it is really, it just comes down to the individual woman, you know, and I wish there was a way to show that women actually do end up benefiting when they help other women throughout their careers. I'm starting to see more of this. I'm starting to see, again, more in the millennial generation. I'm starting to see more women who do want to advocate for other women, who do want to create opportunities for women. And also I'm starting to see a lot of women vote with their feet. They leave companies that are not supportive, that are not offering the values or cultures that they like, you know, and that's why, you know, I think so many women leave STEM fields. So there's no easy answer, unfortunately. Yeah, do you have anything to add, MEADOW? Have you seen?
It's I have not seen a solution, but I have seen, I have witnessed, I haven't necessarily experienced, but witnessed that exact same thing. And I think Ruchika's right in that it's a lot of it has to do with what's the competition, right? Is there only one spot available, and so I think when you broaden that, it helps. And I think also talking about it, right? Some people may not even realize that they are kind of being exclusionary, and that we really need to have an environment where we're helping people up. And I think throughout history we've shown that when we bring this to light and we bring people along, we build allies, and it's a matter of getting that conversation started.
I was so pleased that Chief Justice Barbara Madsen could join us, because I know she's been instrumental in the Commission on Gender Equity. And I was hoping that you might make a few comments about some of the things that that's been going on in the courts and that you've been part of with your commission thinking about on a broader scale at a societal level as well. We've been talking a lot about businesses here, but I think there was another angle that I was very interested in when we spoke earlier.
Well, I guess what I would maybe make a comment about is an initiative that I'm involved in. It's the Washington Initiative for Diversity. And what it is an effort by leaders in the legal community to bring diversity and inclusion to the legal profession as a whole. And so as I've been listening to the two speakers here, it just is very much tracks what my own experience has been in working with the initiative. The notion that we all have implicit bias is something that we did a presentation on at a summit that we provided last year for leaders in the legal profession. And so many people who attended that session had no idea. They'd never heard the word implicit bias. They had no idea that they had an implicit bias. And so I think that that's a place that there's a common theme in my view, is that people don't even understand that they're exhibiting biases. And so when you give them the studies and you say, if you take out the name of the applicant, for example, and you look at an application, 9 times out of 10, the result will be different from the evaluator when they don't know the name of the applicant and when they do. And so this tracks much of what we have found in our legal profession. I think, in fact, perhaps the legal profession is even less forward-thinking in the business case that you've been talking about, the business case for diversity. You think that the business case would be the most important case, but the truth is it doesn't seem to be. It seems to be that that implicit bias overcomes the business imperative for the inclusion and the diversity that we're trying to achieve in our legal profession. I'm heartened, though, in the legal profession that there are leaders in that world that care enough to come to the sessions that we have been providing through the initiative. As to the courts, routinely, in fact, just a few years ago, there was quite a dust-up over the King County Bar Association, which has a judicial evaluation where the attorneys rate the judges, and the result really appeared to be gender biased. Women judges came out at the bottom of the polls. And so we took this really critical look to see, how can we change this, this polling so that we can get at those issues which are gender bias or race biased, and eliminate that bias in our questions. I don't think we've gotten there yet, but we see this over and over with judges. Judges of color have so many more, personal affronts that occur in their courtrooms than the average judge. So we're probably right where most of the other industries, if you think about the law as an industry, I think we're probably right about where most of them are, or maybe we lag behind even in terms of being a very conservative profession, personality and relationship driven. If you look like me, I'm probably going to be your friend. I'm probably going to find an opportunity for you. And if you don't look like me, then I probably am not going to make much effort to find that opportunity for you. So I just think you have to continue to be intentional in addressing the issues of diversity and inclusion. And I think you are absolutely right when you say it has to start at the top. I have not seen it work any other way. We have diversity committees in every law firm, but until the leadership of that firm makes a commitment, nothing happens.
Hi, and sorry if you've already gone over some of the stuff I wanted to ask you about. I'm sorry to pop in late. So the first question I had was about a study that was just covered by the Washington Post today about women on boards and the effect that has on mergers and acquisitions. The study found that a surprising disparity between boards that are exclusively male for the most part and boards that have women on it in terms of how many mergers and acquisitions they approve. And given that a lot of those mergers and acquisitions, if not more than half of them, end in failure or end up being bad business decisions, maybe you could discuss a little bit the benefits of having women on boards and diversity on the leadership of companies. And then I had a quick one after that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so that's actually a great question, because one of my favorite interviews that I had for the Diversity Advantage was with the CEO, John Brock, the CEO of Coca-Cola Enterprises. So they're the largest bottler of Coca-Cola in the world. They're a multi-billion-dollar listed company. And just in fact this year it got approved and the merger is going through, but they had a huge financial transaction that would have been very risky, that would have that required a lot of thinking about. So they basically sold their North American bottling business back to Coca-Cola. So it's a huge transaction. And what John Brock told me and what I found really inspiring is he said, and bear in mind, he's a 70-year-old white man based in the South. The company's based in Atlanta, Georgia, and he was born and brought up in Atlanta, Georgia, but he's been a huge and tireless advocate for women in the workplace. He said, I don't think we would have been able to go through such a complex financial transaction as smoothly as we did if we didn't have women on our board, if we didn't have a Hispanic person on our board, if we didn't have an African American person on our board. So that diversity of thought and being able to look at this complex, like exceedingly, we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar financial transaction in a way and view it from every different angle, I don't think we would have gotten to where we got to. So it was really, really heartening for him to say that, and I included it in the book, and I was like, oh, this is great, this is a money quote. So I think, I know, thinking like a journalist, but I think, diversity when it comes to leadership, it really helps you approach a problem because, it's not easy having different people who don't look the same to avoid groupthink. It's not easy. But you do need people questioning the process. You do need people challenging the way. And the best and most innovative decisions are made that way. Now, I think it's interesting because sometimes people say, oh, the reason why we need more women in leadership is because they're actually risk averse. And sometimes, people, throw companies, they bring companies to the ground because, men are very hard charging and they're not risk averse. And I don't think that's actually true. And now there's research to show that when it comes to risk taking, actually men and women are about equal. But where the difference is women actually end up being quite analytical. Again, this is very counterintuitive, and our society tells us, women make decisions based on emotion and men make it based on logic. But I really think it's that power of getting people who are different in every way, and I don't just think men and women, but I think educational background, I think industry background. I think more boards are starting to realize actually having a millennial on our board is really important. We can't, for example, Starbucks, the majority of our consumers are millennials and our board is, made up of 60 or 70-year-old men. So we need to rethink this and think about how to recruit more millennials on our board. Starbucks had an initiative around this. So I think it's really about having different ideas and different angles and viewpoints when you go through these very, very big major decisions. And I think every company is fighting against competition. They're fighting against competition from other countries as well, and companies in other countries. So the more ideas and more multiculturalism you have in those decisions, the better decisions you're going to make. Like, there's no way around that. Do you have anything to add, MEADOW? I think that's great.
And my other question was completely unrelated. So at the establishment, I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about your conversations on commenters. So I personally really dislike internet commenters and have actually pushed to get rid of them on Crosscut at times. But I mean, if you look at them, if you look at Twitter, if you look at Reddit, it seems like white male assholes dominate the conversation a lot of the time. So I was curious just what your thoughts are on online space for having discussions and conversation and trying to push issues forward, which is what comments and all of these platforms are really supposed to be about, kind of spreading ideas and talking about them and growing them. So what are your thoughts on that space?
Tricky, right? Because on the one hand, you really do want, and it's also tricky because I come from a country where press freedom is questionable. I'm from Singapore originally. So press freedom and the opportunity to speak up about issues is questionable, and there is censorship. Certainly, if you talk about the government, there are ramifications. At the same time, the idea behind it, or at least the excuse that was given when kind of all these acts around press freedom were brought about was we're a very multicultural, very diverse society, and if we give people the tools if we give people tools of free speech without any censorship, we are going to face a lot of people who come up with these racist tropes or offend entire cultures. It could end up in, all sorts of violence and that sort of thing. And, I think some of the ideas they had back then, we're starting to see now with the internet, right? We are starting to see people being called really, really horrific things when there's the opportunity to do so. So it is really tricky and complicated. At the establishment, the reason we took this stance is because we really felt that our writers needed to be protected. And there are forums that they will still get attacked. A lot of email addresses, a lot of Twitter accounts are public, and they still do get attacked. I was talking about my experience in having been, being a journalist online. I've definitely faced a lot of harassment in different ways. But I think as an editor, as someone who has that position of leadership, you have a real opportunity to take a stance and say, we are not going to put up with this. We are going to protect our writers. And obviously there are checks and balances you go through as a journalist, as a writer, as an editor anyway, right? So what you publish is supposed to be true. It's supposed to be factual. It's supposed to be checked. And then when these people want to come and they want to talk about all sorts of other things that are irrelevant, you're not giving them the space to do that. There are other spaces that are available, but it shouldn't be something that you provide and encourage. And that's sort of the decision we made at the establishment. Yeah.
As I mentioned, I've spent the last almost decade working in politics, and it's, as I said, it's astonishing to see what people will email or call and say, and the comments. Sometimes you just have to feel like, oh, I got to turn these off. But I've seen a lot more publications change over to where you have to have accountability, right? There's freedom of speech, but you're still accountable and responsible for that speech. And I think one of the areas where we really, in the age of the internet and this sort of sense of anonymity that really doesn't exist, I think if we are going to allow these sorts of comments to take place, I do think that there needs to be some sort of way where you have to be bold enough to share your identity, your true identity. And in the media, we can't be afraid to then call out. So you saw, again, kind of going back to the comments around the Seattle City Council vote on the arena, where by the time it actually made some press around what people were saying, it was like, well, some people are saying some really inappropriate things, and it was very watered down. So if we're going to have a conversation about, what this says about our culture and our society, we can't water it down, and people need to be accountable and responsible, and we should not make it easy for people to anonymously make up and say, I am Joe 1632 ice cream, and I think you're a really awful person, right?
When the person who's actually writing or making themselves public in any way, whether you're a leader, whether you're in politics, whether you're in law, whatever it is, in any public arena, that person is putting themselves out there, right? So there has to be that dual accountability. I completely believe that. Yeah.
Thank you both for this wonderful exchange. In the spirit of sharing, I just wanted to share some of my experiences working in the corporate workforce. I'm no longer in the corporate workforce. I'm self-employed, so I don't have to deal with this anymore for the most part. But I've had the opportunity to work in corporate India, corporate France, and corporate America. And I think Ruchika, what you were saying about the top-down approach, and I think that's very important because both in India and in France, the thing that I heard very often was that you're an Indian woman, and an Indian woman is nice, and you're not, and why are you so aggressive? You can just say it more in a nicer way, and so on and so forth. And it was actually in this company that happened to be an American company, where I think the culture was different, and where it did not matter. That's not something that I heard every day, and it did not matter. And it was important for me to speak my mind. So, and I think that just, and Western Europe, I know they have lots to offer as far as maternity leave and such things are concerned, but But I think inherently there is that culture of expecting a woman, the likability factor is important. So yeah, I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. That was it. You're absolutely right. And back to your point, unfortunately, likability has started showing up in very many different ways, whether we look at the elections, whether we look at the experience of individual women and why women leave companies. Most of the time it's not for any other reason, but just not being able to find a place within that culture and that industry. So